Kathryn Finney. I am the founder and managing director of Digital Undivided. And I'm going to start off by telling you a little story. So I'm not going to talk to you about drinking beer, but beer is a part of this story. I grew up in the Midwest in the 1980s. I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and in Milwaukee. In my early childhood in Milwaukee, my father was a brewery worker at Schlitz Brewery. How many people know Schlitz, have heard of Schlitz Brewery? It's kind of like a hipster thing now. It was the community. It was the people you hung out with. You did Boy Scouts, you did Girl Scouts, you went to church together, you had Christmas parties, all these great things. So you can imagine how our community in Milwaukee was devastated when Schlitz shut down. And it wasn't just Schlitz that shut down, it was Pabst, it was all these other breweries that shut down in a place like Milwaukee where breweries were really the center of the economy. And it caused a lot of pain. People lost their families, they lost their jobs, they lost their homes. But my father always had this vision of himself that was larger than the vision others had put on him as a black man growing up in the 50s and 60s. And so he found himself at this workforce center called OIC, which was started in the 80s, Opportunity Industrial Centers. And he found himself at a course taught by a gentleman from IBM. It was a C++ course. On the weekends, he took it while working third shift, unpacking boxes from a truck. And he fell in love. And so at 36, he took an unpaid internship, if you can imagine, at 36, taking an unpaid internship at IBM. And from there, got a position at Digital Equipment. I don't know, how many of you know DEC? Yeah, you have to be kind of old, that's old school. Like, DEC was like purchased by Compaq, which was purchased by HP, which was, it's like 10 companies later. And then he became an executive at Microsoft, one of the early and first black men engineers. And then when he passed away, he was an executive at EMC. And all of this was because a gentleman from IBM decided to take off his Sundays to come and teach a group of displaced factory workers code. And so that story has stuck with me my entire life. And so when my family moved to Minneapolis, I grew up in Minneapolis, home of Prince, for those of you who know. I went to Rutgers, then went from Rutgers to Yale, where I wasn't graduated. I know, that's me, if you can see me up there, and that little thing. Went to Yale, of course, was not studying anything to do with computer science or technology. That would have been too obvious and too logical. So I became an epidemiologist and worked abroad, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, working with women, HIV/AIDS, and other STIs. And so it was great, and it was wonderful work. It was really important work. But two things happened. One, I had a sick parent. My father became ill. So I had to come back to the States. It's really hard to have a sick family member and be 6,000 to 7,000 miles away. And then I also happened to fall in love as well. And it's really difficult to maintain a relationship when you're gone 3 weeks out of the month. So I came back to the States, and it was while in the States, newly married, trying to refigure out what I was going to do. I was going to dedicate my life to traveling abroad and doing great work abroad, that I started something called a blog. Now, this was in 2003. And I remember trying to explain to my mother that I started a blog, and she's like, "You went to Yale for what? Why are you, like, what, how is this connected?" But it started off as a hobby. It was a way for me to interact with a community. I was living in Philadelphia. I didn't know anyone. I was newly married and really wanted to connect with others. And so I started this blog. It was all about shopping and the amount of time I was spending at Nordstrom's Rack, really not thinking that it was going to be anything big. About 6 months after I started it, though, I was contacted by the Associated Press, who did an article on people who traveled to go budget shopping. And it took off. Also happened to be a good time because the economy was starting to go down. And people were starting to care about budget shopping. Believe it or not, in 2003, 2004, people thought I was crazy for writing about saving money. And so from that, it grew, it turned into a book, I did lots of TV and lots of other fun things. And I had this idea of, wow, I could, that's the selfie. I'm partially responsible for that, I'm sorry. I want to apologize to you guys. But I had this idea of doing something in regards to Black women in beauty. Black women purchase over 40% of all hair care products in the United States, even though we're about 7% of the US population. So I was like, hey, I have this great idea, I have the platform, I know how to build things, I have built a community, I'm really, really excited. And I entered into one of the first incubator programs in New York City. And it was the first time in my life that people had no expectations of me. Not just low expectations, none. No one would speak to me. In fact, there was part of the program was you would just be randomly called on to pitch your idea. I never once got called on, ever. And when I asked, well, why aren't you guys calling on me? They said, well, we didn't think you wanted to speak. Now, at that time, I was doing a lot of television. I was on the Today Show, things like that. So obviously speaking was not my problem. But they made these decisions for me. And they made these decisions based on my gender and race. And it was a really powerful example for me, because I grew up with technology having this sort of massive impact on my family and on my own personal life. And I was being denied that opportunity because of my race and my gender. So being the person that I am, I said, okay, I ended up leaving that incubator program, but I continued on with my company, Budget Fashionista, which I later sold, and then went to go work for another woman-led company called Blog Her, which represented millions and millions of women social media stars. That was then later sold. So I worked for 2 women-led companies that were sold and saw the impact, the economic impact of being able to make your own decisions and determine your own future, how that had on me and others around me, how it allowed me and the women who I worked for at Blog Her to also impact other women. And it was just really this cascading effect, all from this ability for us to be able to create our own destinies and our own economic futures. And so I took that and had this idea to do a conference for women who were like me, Black and Latina women who are founders of startups. Like, I knew we existed, but I would often go to conferences, and this was in 2010, 2011, where I would be the only Black person in a room full of thousands of people. I went to South by Southwest the year that they launched Twitter, and we counted of maybe 35,000 people there. There was only about 56 Black people, and maybe 25 Latinos out of that many. So we weren't being represented. We weren't showing up. We weren't there. And we wanted to create a way for us to be there. And so we started Focus 100. The conference was a total idea. We had no idea who was going to show up. We went and we begged all our friends. We were like, please come, please help us. And we got 120 people for our first conference. And it really started this whole trajectory for Digital Undivided, but not only just for us, but for other women and people of color in this space. And so in 2014, which was the 3rd year of us doing the conference, we noticed the most successful part was this part called our Focus Fellows, which were Black and Latina women who were founders of startups. And so we provided them with mentorship, we provided them with sort of a structured virtual program, and we saw that that was the most successful part. And we were really excited about being able to take that offline and duplicate it. So we went to pitch our funders and friends, and we said, it's hard out there for a sister who's trying to get in tech. And they said, that's great, we understand, but how hard? And we realized we couldn't quantify it. And so we went to go look for the numbers, and what we found at that time, no one had thought to look at how many women of color were actually in the startup ecosystem. In fact, no one had even looked at how many women were in the startup ecosystem. There was no numbers. This was 2014, and no one had thought to count. And for me, and for those of you who've done sort of field work, as an epidemiologist, that brought up an experience that I had when I was working in South Africa. At the time, this was in the late 90s, and we were looking for data on just sort of baseline data to be able to look at the trends of HIV, particularly in Durban. And so we went to the Department of Health, the newly merged Department of Health, because there used to be like 6 Department of Health, and we asked for that baseline information. And what we realized is no one had thought the count, so there was no baseline information. So no one actually really knew the progression of HIV in that particular community because no one had thought the count from the very beginning. And that reminded, this experience of not having those numbers in regards to Black and Latina women in this space reminded me of that. And it's really difficult to quantify a problem if you can't put a number at it. So again, being the type of people we are, we went and we quantified it. And what we did was, we started a project called Project Diane in 2016. Project Diane looked at women of color, entrepreneurship, and innovation. And we looked at what was going on in this particular space. Very baseline, primary research data, not a lot of analysis. We just wanted to gather the data so that analysis could be done. And what we found was quite shocking. We're actually in the middle of an updated version of Project Diane 2018. Mario Romero, who's going to be with you guys throughout this week, he's leading it, and he has a lot of great information if you want to ask him. But I'll present some of the things that we found from 2016. So one of the things that was really interesting was the average raised by Black women was $36,000. The average raise for their ventures in terms of outside funding. The average raise for mostly white, mostly male founders of failed startups was 1.3 million. So we were raising, the best of us were raising less than 3% of some of the worst of the larger startup community. And how can you be competitive in a business sense if you're only able to get a fraction of the money you need to be able to scale and grow? We also found that of the total amount of venture funding that had been given out between 2010 and 2016, Black women had only received 0.2% of that funding. Again, we're 7% of the population, so we were not receiving any sizable amount of funding to be able to grow our companies. We also found that there was only approximately 18 Black women who had raised more than $1 million in venture funding. And you know, $1 million sounds like a lot, and it is, but it isn't when you are building a company. It isn't when you think of how much Uber has raised, right? Great company, sort of, but but they've raised billions. You think about how much money Apple has in its reserves, which is over $100 billion right now. So 18 Black women raising over $1 million is not good in this context. Another thing, and this is probably one of the more fascinating things we found with Project Diane, was the schools that a majority of the Black women founders came from were not the institutions, the same institutions that a majority of the mostly white male founders come from. So often in the startup community, you hear Stanford and MIT, and you hear all these, that's where you have to go if you want to find startups, and that's where people and the best startups come from, but not the best Black women-led startups don't come from those schools. And probably the most fascinating thing is that we found that Spelman and Stanford produced the same number of Black women-led founders. So if you were an investor and you were looking for diverse founders, going to Stanford may not be the best route, probably isn't the best route, but going to Spelman, going to Howard, going to even Columbia University, those would be the better opportunities for you. And that was really interesting for us because one of the things we often hear is, oh, there's no one to invest in, or there's no good Black female founders, or there's no Latina founders. We don't know who to invest in. And that's probably because you're going to the wrong places. And so when we started to analyze what to do with all this data, what does this all mean? And what we looked at was what creates a great ecosystem? What makes a robust startup ecosystem, no matter where you're at? And it's really three sort of things. It's access to capital, access to training, and access to networks. Those interacting together, and it'll stay up for a little while, are really, really important in creating this robust ecosystem. You cannot have just two of those. You can't have one of those. You need to have all three of those working together. And what we found was missing for women of color entrepreneurs was that these things were not connected and they weren't working together. So you might have a really small pool of money over here, maybe a network or two over here, but they weren't connected. You might have training, but it's maybe the wrong type of training. Maybe it's not training on how to build a high growth company, but it's more training for people who are doing at-home lifestyle businesses. So if you had a big idea, there would be no place for you to go because all the funding is targeted towards people who are doing very, very small businesses that aren't scalable. And what we do at Big and Digital Divided is really bring those things together for women of color. We have a 3,000 square foot innovation center in downtown Atlanta in the Hurt building. If you guys are from Atlanta, come visit us. It's where Matlock was filmed. That's where most people know it from. We have our big incubator program, which is a 26-week incubator program for Black and Latina women who have ideas, who can build those ideas, and we take them through the process. And then we also have the Harriet Fund, which is a small impact fund that invests in companies led by Black and Latina women, high growth companies. I'm a GP of that as well, along with Gayla Jennings O'Byrne, who's based out of New York. So we try to bring all those together. So that's me and one of our partners, Darlene. I just like that picture, so I just put that in there. And that's the sign actually in our innovation center. Everyone likes that because it's really fun. And so our impact has been really interesting. We've helped over 56 companies raise over $20 million. And in that process, we've learned a lot. And so before I leave you, I want to share with you some of the things that we learned. As a scientist, I always want to put out my data, get feedback, talk about it. That's like another one. So probably the biggest lesson we learned was that everyone wants to live a creative life in which they control. And that really entrepreneurship in tech is just a tool to get there. And that realization has really helped us in our programming and how we design our programming. One of the things that we do, and our funders sometimes bristle when I say this, is we're okay with people not being entrepreneurs. We think it's okay if you come through our program and decide that it doesn't work for you, that entrepreneurship is too hard or it's not the right time for you to do it. We think that's okay. We don't think there's anything wrong with that. We actually think that entrepreneurship is hard and it is difficult, and anyone can do it if they want to do it, but if you don't want to do it, it's okay that you don't want to do it too. We also found, and this is particularly important, going back to the discussion of where do Black and Latina female founders come from, is that the path is as important as the destination. What we often found in the space that we're in, everyone talks about the destination, raising $5 million, building the company, becoming an ex-Uber, whatever, but they don't talk about what it takes to get there. And the very few times people talk about what it takes to get there, it's often in the lens of primarily white men. But they don't talk about what it takes as a woman to go through this path. What does it take as a mother? What does it take as a 45-year-old white man to go through this space? Because ageism is a big challenge also in tech. And one of the things that we found is an interesting story. We have a program called Confident Founders, which works with the spiritual and emotional health of our entrepreneurs. We realize that that is as important as their ability to build a company. And so we had this gathering, we were talking about different challenges. And one of our founders said, I feel guilty being here. I feel guilty building my company. And we were like, well, where did that guilt come from? And she said, well, I feel like I should be with my children, or I should be, working a little bit more, or I should be doing something for someone else. The fact that I'm here building this company and I'm taking time to do something that's a dream of mine is not something I thought I should be doing. And that was really powerful to me. And I don't think we would have learned that if we had a traditional program that was focused more on just, these outcomes if we didn't look at the destination. And so we realized that in our Confident Founders program, we really do have to address that guilt, and we have to address that particular issue. We also found that money is not the problem, it is a problem. As with most communities, we have challenges around money. Money is a very weighty subject, no matter what community you're in. But in particularly our communities, where we come oftentimes from a place of scarcity. And so how do we talk about money? We had a really interesting conversation. One of our founders, who is part of our Focus Fellow company, raised $3 million. And it was sort of in the media, it was in Ebony, and she had some family members email her and said, I hear you just raised $3 million, congratulations. So can I borrow I need $2,000 to go buy a refrigerator. And what she realized, and it was a very difficult conversation to explain, I don't actually have $3 million. My company has $3 million, and it has to be used for all these different things. But we realized that the narrative around money, particularly in this space, and money in our community is a very weighty topic that needs further discussion. That was a really interesting story. And last but not least, what we realized is in order to do differently, you have to think differently. And really encouraging communities to think differently. Religious communities, communities that are very entrenched in certain thought processes. And how do you get them to move in different ways and to think different ways? And hopefully there'll be some time for Q&A. I can share some of that with Q&A, but that was one of the things that we learned, that you really have to focus on getting people to think differently and to take them outside of their comfort zone and to remove the sort of boxes that are around us. You cannot be innovative if you find yourself in a box. You cannot be innovative if you're just between these walls. You have to remove your walls, and you have to expose yourself, and you have to be vulnerable. That is where true innovative thought and innovation comes from.